Imagine, following World War III, all the nations of the world agree to 50 years of strict isolation from one another in order to prevent additional conflicts. 50 years later, the United States comes out of exile, only to learn that no one else went into isolation. A story based on the idea above might go something like this. It was a curious solution, and nobody expected it to be as easy as it was. 50 years of isolation. Nobody knew who fired the first shots. Some said it was the Chinese, some said it was the North Koreans, others said it was the Americans. In the end, it really didn't matter because everyone ended up involved in some way. We were all guilty and shared the same sins. But for all the doomsaying about the end of the world, things actually weren't that bad. Well, compared to how bad it could have been. 20th century novels convinced us that World War III would result in a blasted hellscape. Billions dead, nothing left standing. Perhaps in our darkest moments, we still retained a shred of humanity. Or perhaps we learned from the terrible brand of warfare waged in the 40s. Rather than missiles striking innocent population centers, surgical strikes and tactical nuclear weapons simply devastated infrastructure and military targets. Hundreds of millions had still perished. Collateral damage, fallout, famine, and disease. But the worst hadn't happened. Eiffel Tower and St. Basil's Cathedral were still standing. In a rather striking twist of irony, by waging World War III, we had destroyed mostly just the tools we would need to wage World War IV. After that came the grand plan. 50 years of isolation. Everyone expected us to resist the plan the most, and were surprised when, after a national referendum, we ended up being the most eager. Walls went up. Trade routes gradually eased and then stopped altogether. The doors were shut, and for 50 years we prospered. We had lost many of the cheap luxuries we had grown accustomed to, but agriculture surged as, lacking imported crops, we raised thousands of hectares of corn to grow our own. Oil deposits were uncapped. Unemployment dropped to less than 1% as millions of lost jobs suddenly came in high demand. It was a simple life, but we were happy. Americana had returned. 50 years passed in an eye blink, and the great reunification would begin. All the nations of the world to meet and share what they had learned. It wasn't going to be easy, of course. The war had destroyed nearly every satellite. We would need to seek out people to communicate with manually. Our first attempt at contact was to head north to our oldest allies. Canada had been one of the most apprehensive countries with regards to the isolation, and actually considered joining America in joint isolation, but the United Nations Council soundly rejected the notion. As our diplomatic convoys crossed the border and entered Toronto, they were shocked by what they found. Hunger, disease, poverty. The once great city was decaying and largely vacant. Similar reports came from Montreal and Ottawa. Upon contacting the Canadian government, the truth came out. It was a ruse, a great big ruse. The world, convinced that America had been, at best, indirectly responsible for the war, had collectively agreed to formulate fake isolation plans and leave us in the dark. The plan was to bring the world and humanity as a whole into a bright and shining future. The results were less than satisfactory. If the world had advanced to prosperity, it certainly didn't show in Canada. Having lost their largest trading partner, Canada found themselves out of the global market. Asia had no use for Canadian manufacturing, and Eastern Europe had filled demand to Europe. Canada began to market their oil reserves, but shortly after the walls went up, the United Nations declared a global moratorium on fossil fuels to allow the Earth to heal. Canada was, almost literally, left out in the cold and had suffered greatly. However, as bad as the situation in Canada was, it wouldn't compare to what we found to the south. We sent diplomatic teams south, just as we did north. Teams that were never heard of again. Crossing the border, they initially reported that little appeared different from before the war. There was running water, power, though it bore all the hallmarks of a relatively poor country. But as they would near Mexico City, they would just go dark. We weren't sure what we were going to do. We didn't want our first reconnection with the world to involve military force, invading a country to find our teams. Then, Weeks after the first team had gone dark, we learned something new. On the side of a road in South Texas, in a van, lay one of our ambassadors, beaten, bloodied, and mutilated. Along with him were the heads of the 24 men and women who escorted him. The ambassador had been returned with a message and shared with us what he had learned. It seemed that while Mexico had taken a few licks during the Great War, that story was not true for South America. In fact, they survived the war almost completely untouched. Lacking global strike capabilities, they were largely ignored by the warring parties. The starry-eyed isolation plan was largely a European one, and the plan simply seemed to exclude the entire Western Hemisphere. Why bother with South America? They had little to offer the world, and they were too far and isolated. In fact, they even went as far as to congratulate themselves for freeing South America of American influence and corruption. With Mexico's government weakened, it left the country primed for the largest military force in the region to take over, the cartels. Mexico had become a narco state. Without any threat from government forces, American or otherwise, the cartels expanded influence worldwide, filling the economic hole left by America's absence with a global drug ring. South of Panama, without the interference of America, as the isolation planners would put it, South America was free to pursue its own destiny, a destiny that seemed to largely revolve around 50 years of civil wars and military coups. Over the coming months, we learned much from Europe, Africa, and Asia, and replaced the wonder we held in our hearts with cynicism and anger and disgust. Instead of the utopia that had been envisioned, there was nothing more than endless war. While North Korea had fallen in World War III, China now occupied the Korean peninsula. Most of Eastern Europe had fallen to Russia. Africa was, well, it was still Africa. In Europe, the situation was little improved. The European Union had combined into the United European States, headed by Germany and France. The United Kingdom had undergone its own degree of voluntary isolationism, withdrawing further into itself. It attempted to reunify the Commonwealth, but Chinese control of the South Pacific left Australia and New Zealand subject to absolute trade embargoes. To the north, Scandinavia had suffered immensely. Without oil and the American economy to sell their investments, Norway had gone from one of the most prosperous nations to a state whose crippling debts had to be underwritten every year by the rest of the U.S. Threats from Russia had pushed Finland into a military state, and tensions were high that invasion could occur any day. Pushing for hardline social reform, tolerance, and acceptance, refugees from the war-torn North Africa and Southwest Asia flooded by the millions into Europe. Cries to even attempt to slow the flow were ignored as the mewling complaints of the bigoted. Before long, the population outpaced the capability to feed and employ people, and the dream of prosperity, where no man had to want for anything, had waned into a slow, cold recession that had lasted for nearly 4 decades. Hundreds of square miles of cheap, filthy government tenements were erected ringing the major cities. Everywhere we had gone, we found that over and over that good intentions mean nothing without the willpower to see them out. Our envoys were given a cold reception and simply told to leave. America wasn't wanted anymore, they insisted, and so we returned home, and then we rebuilt the walls. Maybe the world needed 50 more years,